Welcome back to the Energy and Environment track of the 2022 Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm Erin Jordan. I'm an investigative reporter for the Gazette, and I'm your moderator for this session on electric vehicles and local utility grids. We have a really great panel with us here today, and we'll have them introduce themselves in just a minute. Before that, we have a very quick video from our track sponsor, Alliant Energy. All right, great. Got a lot of people joining us here. Looks like 20 or so people so far, so that is fantastic. We will just ask the audience to send in your questions here, and we'll try to integrate those into our conversation. All of the panels for the conference have closed captioning available and are recorded. So yeah, just sort of, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to take just a moment to introduce themselves and their connection to the topic. Why don't we start with Stu Anderson?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm Stu Anderson. I'm Director of the Transportation Development Division at the Iowa Department of Transportation. And our involvement in electric vehicles has spanned quite a few years. We have two different perspectives that we've been involved in. Probably the most relevant to this conversation is regarding providing some funding to support the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the state. We've done that initially using some Volkswagen settlement funds over the last 3-4 years, but then more recently, of course, there's a new federal formula program that came out of the infrastructure bill that's provided significant revenue to all states to help support further installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So we'll be administering at the DOT that program. Our other perspective is, of course, on the funding of our city, county, and state roads and streets and highways. We did, working with the legislature a couple of years ago, implement some road user fees for electric vehicles so that as we see more electric vehicle adoption in the state, that they're paying their equitable share as they are with other vehicles. And so we've been involved in that effort as well.
That's great. Adam?
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Adam Jablonski. I'm the Vice President of Project Development at MidAmerican Energy. So my group is responsible for the evaluation, development, and construction of our renewable projects, both wind and solar. We run other capital projects for the company. We investigate and apply for grant funding in my group, but the connection to this topic is my group is responsible for the implementation of our public charging infrastructure for EVs. We also run our rebate programs for EVs and charging infrastructure for the company.
That's great. Marc?
I'm a retired engineer. I worked with General Motors for 17 years. And our division built electric motors. So I've been interested in electric drive for quite a long time. I've been driving an electric vehicle since 2013, and I've been powering my own home solar panels since 2013. I now consult with the Linn Clean Energy District here in Cedar Rapids and help them with various energy topics.
Well, that's great. My earliest connection to electric vehicles was my grandfather had electrified a yellow Volkswagen Bug in his garage. So that was in the 80s sometime. So I remember seeing that there plugged in. Just with regard to where things stand right now with the EV landscape in Iowa, Iowans have registered more than 8,300 electric vehicles with the state through the end of last year. Stu, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what those trends have looked like. I know you've noticed some trends regarding like the plug-in electric hybrids versus pure electric cars, and there may be some other trends you've noticed.
Yeah, and actually through April of this year, we're 9,400 electric vehicles registered in the state, and that includes both plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles. And we don't have any more current numbers than that right now, but certainly that number has grown probably relatively significantly because we have seen increasing growth rates for electric vehicle purchases, primarily in the battery electric vehicles. Early on, we saw, of course, a lot more plug-in hybrid electric vehicles as those were predominantly the models available, but that definitely has shifted. Of those 9,400 vehicles, 5,000 are battery electric vehicles and 4,400 are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And so I think over the last 5 years, that growth rate for battery electric vehicles alone is about 65% growth a year. And we certainly are expecting to see that growth rate continue at relatively high levels because we are seeing more models become available as more manufacturers make more models at more varying price points available. So we are expecting to see continued growth. Of course, it's still a relatively small percentage. We have over 4 million vehicles registered in Iowa, so 9,400 vehicles, a small percentage of that. But as we looked out to do our forecasts out to 2040, we think the percentage of electric vehicles in Iowa could be in that 7 to 14% range. So that's like 225,000 vehicles to 450,000 electric vehicles. So it's a pretty broad range because there's a lot of variables in how quickly we'll see that adoption rate in the state, but we do expect that to grow significantly.
And Marc, you drive an electric Nissan Leaf, and I know you keep track of EVs out on the road. What would you add about adoption that you've seen?
Well, I've been driving electric for 9 years, and that makes you always look around in your traffic stream to see who else is driving electric. And in the last year or so, there's been a marked increase in the number of Teslas we see. We drove from Cedar Rapids down to North Liberty recently, and we saw 3 Teslas on that drive, about 25 minutes. And that's pretty unusual to see that many. And now it's not that unusual. Any place we drive here in eastern Iowa, we're seeing a lot of Teslas on the road. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of all the other manufacturers now that they're starting to ramp up their models.
Yeah, that's it is interesting. I think when you know what the cars look like and know for the models, you definitely notice them more when you're out driving on the interstate and other places. So just looking, I believe it's the Department of Energy that keeps track, has the most comprehensive list of the charging stations in Iowa. I was just looking at that yesterday. It looks like Iowa had about 270 charging stations. With some of the trends of where we're seeing the highest concentration of EV registrations, how well does that infrastructure that we have now match the registrations in the state? Stu, I don't know if you have a thought of that, or anyone really.
Yeah, so I guess I'll give my perspective. I'll be curious in Marc's perspective as an owner that actually uses those charging stations. I think it's important to have an understanding of what those charging stations look like, first of all. So I think your 270 number includes both level 2 charging stations, which are those relatively slow charging units that you tend to see more at the grocery stores and shopping centers. The level 3 chargers, which I think in Iowa is about 57 of those exist across Iowa that are non-Tesla charging stations. I think there's another 16 or so level 3 DC fast charging that are proprietary to Teslas. And so those provide the much faster charging speeds. There you can get a pretty decent charge. Again, it varies by vehicle and battery. But in 30 minutes, you can get a pretty decent charge of that fast charging infrastructure. And that's certainly the focus of our program that we'll be administering at the federal level. To install more of that fast charging across our initially interstate corridors. But, we have relatively good distribution, but there's certainly some challenges. Of course, when you need a charge, you need a charge. It's not always going to be convenient. And I think another issue that is out there is the charging infrastructure that's out there isn't necessarily as I guess I'll say reliable, but maybe a better word is readily available. Sometimes they're down or not working, or there's only a few plugs. And so if there's use there, that can be challenging, which is one of the reasons why the federal government has invested in this new program to try to make sure there's more charging infrastructure out there and that it's more reliable and assured to be functioning with more ports.
So if I can add, I did read one publication where they were ranking the states and the availability of public charging infrastructure. And Iowa's ranking in that was 14th, and they were considering both public charging infrastructure compared to registered vehicles in the state. So I thought that was a good number, you know, being in the top half of those rankings. I know MidAmerican has, and this is what we were trying to do a few years ago, is to address the range anxiety. And, you know, I think Stu mentioned that there was 57 non-Tesla DC fast charging stations in Iowa. By the end of this year, MidAmerican will have installed 41. So a large chunk of that. And what we were trying to do there is, you know, address that range anxiety. We were targeting our service territory, had to be located in our service territory, which is the majority of the state. But we were trying to place those within 50 miles of each other, you know, so people could feel comfortable in going on a trip, just like you would do with your gasoline car, and being able to, you know, travel long distances, not just in city and short distances, like a lot of people, I think, use EVs for currently.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know here in Eastern Iowa, for many years, I started in 2013, my leaf had a fast charge port, but I never used a fast charger because the closest one was Chicago. And that lasted for 6 or 7 years of the 9 years that I've been driving that car. But now there's a lot more chargers that are beginning to appear. Many of them are branded with MidAmerican through the partnership that MidAmerican has. They work very well. Tesla has the best charging network across the United States. Just here in the Iowa City, Cedar Rapids area, there used to be one. It was built maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Now there are 3 sections, and each one of the 3 have 8 chargers at those Tesla stations. So it's really nice for people who own Teslas. Tesla has announced that by the end of the year, they hope to open up their Tesla network to other non-Tesla electric cars, which would be great because there's a lot of those around.
Now, Stu, you've mentioned the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, which is slated to bring a little over $50 million to Iowa for improving this charging infrastructure. Could you tell us a little bit about the parameters of what that funding has to go to and what Iowa's proposed about how to spend that?
Yeah, so this new National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program was established by the infrastructure bill that was signed into law about a year ago in November of 21. And this funding is available over 5 years. As you said, it's about $50 million in total. So on average, we'll get about $10 million per year for this program. And this funding is initially required to be spent to install DC fast charging, that level 3 charging infrastructure along Iowa's major interstates. So in Iowa, that's Interstate 29, Interstate 35, but then also Interstate 80 and Interstate 380. Those are routes that are on this National Alternative Fuel Corridor, which is a national designation for electric vehicles. And so that's a requirement that the initial focus be on building out that network. They want that network to have charging infrastructure at least every 50 miles. And each site should have, has to have at least 4 ports that can provide 150 kilowatts. So it's a relatively high standard compared to at least what was being installed early on in the DC fast charging and what we were doing with some of the Volkswagen funds. After we build out that initial interstate network, which we expect will take 2 to 3 years of the funding, then we will look at other major corridors across the state. And we are envisioning this to be a grant-based program where we will seek applications, probably primarily from the private sector, where they will apply for funding to either upgrade some existing electric vehicle charging sites that may not meet those minimum federal standards now, or to build new sites that meet those $50 million or 50-mile minimum spacing requirements. And so that's what we're working on right now, is developing what that program looks like. We're required to submit a deployment plan to the federal government back in August, and at the end of September, they did certify and approve Iowa's plans. Now we're moving to implementation, and hoping that late this winter we'll have more details on what that application program will look like.
I think when I looked at the registrations in Iowa, the counties with the highest rates, when you compared it with their population, were Johnson, Dallas, Jefferson, and Cerro Gordo. I think about Jefferson County not being on one of those major interstates and not really even a major highway. You know, what about the rural areas of the state? What can we expect for charging there?
I can start on that. I mean, we didn't, when we first started installing our charging stations a few years ago, you know, we thought we were kind of ahead of the curve, and now it's catching up where they're starting to fund these DC fast charging stations at the federal level. So we were installing 50 kW and 150 kW. So those are, you get a 80% charge in under an hour with those. But we didn't necessarily just target, you know, areas along the interstate. It had to be in our service territory because we had to hook into our system. But we put those in some of the more rural areas, I would say. So, you know, if you go to our website or visit apps like PlugShare or ChargePoint, you can see where our charging stations are. You know, and it's not necessarily just along in major metropolitan areas or along interstate highways. We did target our more rural communities as well with these charging stations. So at least if you're in our service territory, hopefully if you live in a rural area or traveling through a rural area and need that, hopefully MidAmerican's got you mostly covered anyway in our service territory in the state.
And on our program that we're administering with federal funds, as I said, after a couple of years, when we get that interstate system built out, we do have full flexibility to build out, and certainly we're expecting we'd be supporting installations at regional centers along major highways. And you point out Jefferson County, of course, Fairfield definitely is a regional center that is on our major commercial industrial network here at the DOT. Of course, another perspective here is we've seen a lot of private sector people have been building out stations even without these public funds. So I think where there's a demand, we certainly expect to see those investments continue, even if it's not necessarily early on through this federal supported program.
A question from a member of our audience specifically for you, Stu. Wondering if you could speak to the survey results that were gathered as part of the deployment plan. What are people desiring in terms of what they want in their charging station experience?
Yeah, so that was an important component of our engagement plan, was to hear from the public about their perspectives on these funds and how they should be deployed. And in particular, yes, we were curious about what type of amenities that the public expects. And generally, it's things that you would expect. You know, they want access 24/7, want to have shelter, access to restroom facilities, also some good lighting at those sites from a security perspective. Also, given the fact that, you know, these charging sessions will take longer than it normally takes to fill up a vehicle, some access to food and beverage also scored pretty high in that amenity survey. And that's why we think a lot of what we'll continue to see, and we have been seeing, is that these sites are generally where there's already convenience stores or truck stops. There's not a requirement that it be at those sites. You know, they could be in other locations, but again, given the broad demand of amenities, we think that's primarily where we will see that demand.
I read that I think it was the state of Wyoming that wanted a variance from the funding, that they had to put it on these major travel corridors. They wanted to use it to drive traffic to less visited parts of the state. How did Iowa decide, you know, how to kind of maybe answer those questions?
Yeah, so some of those western states that really have really rural areas, it's a bit more challenging to administer this program and meet that 50-mile spacing. Although, Iowa's considered a rural state. If you look at our highway corridors, we don't have really long stretches where there's not already services or communities at pretty regular intervals. So we didn't feel we needed to look at any variances from meeting that 50-mile spacing or the number of ports or access. Our utilities provide good service across the state. And so we felt pretty comfortable with the ability to meet those requirements in Iowa.
When I wrote a story in July about whether there are enough charging stations in Iowa to ease drivers' worries about being stranded, one EV user wrote in, seems like kind of irritated about the idea of range anxiety, saying it was a thing of the past. I wanted to ask the panelists what you think about that.
Yeah, I can start. I think it was real a few years ago, and I think it's slowly fading away. That's the main reason we wanted to install our public charging system, was to get rid of that, make people more comfortable with EVs. But I think also advancements in technology have helped solve that. You can go farther with your EV than you were able to, 4, 5, 6 years ago. So but thinking about personal convenience as well, I think a lot of people are used to their fueled vehicles and the convenience that comes with that. And there's still some range anxiety because you still need to plan. Even at the 50 miles apart, there will still need to be some planning in that, where in your traditional internal combustion engine, you really don't need to do that. There's going to be a gas station every 10, 15 miles. You can fill up in 5 minutes. So I think it's still real, but I think it is fading away with technology advancements and with more charging stations available.
Yeah, I think that's true. So many of the EVs now have a 250-mile range. And for a local driver, for commuting or errands or shopping or whatever, 250 miles is enough that it pretty much erases range anxiety, except for long trips. And then on long trips, you just need to plan. You need to be looking where you're going to go and have some kind of an app that'll show you where the chargers are.
And Marc, do you want to tell us with your Leaf, in the winter, your range it can be somewhat limiting.
Yeah, it's a kind of the Achilles heel of electric vehicles. When it gets cold, cold, I mean lower than 20 degrees, down to freezing or so, it's not so bad. But when it gets down to 20 degrees above zero and then lower than that, which it can happen in Iowa, as we know, you can lose upwards of half of your range on a really, really cold and especially a windy day. If you're driving into a stiff headwind, you can lose a lot of range. But that's why these new 250-mile range EVs pretty much do away with the range anxiety, because if your commute is 50 miles, even if you lose half of your 250, you're still down to 125-mile range. And so you're going to be covered. And that's why even in the winter, these newer EVs have enough range that they pretty much do away with local driving range anxiety.
So there are predictions that half of US vehicle sales will be electric by 2030. Just throwing this out to the whole panel, do you think this is likely, and what factors might limit that?
Well, it sounds like Stu doesn't think it's likely. I think I heard his projection in Iowa anyway was 7 to 14%, if I remember that correctly. I think that's a very aggressive goal. The reason I say that is we've seen a slow and steady ramp up with EVs. I think one of the things that's throwing a wrench into that is just vehicle availability. I've heard stories, the Lightning, the Ford Lightning, 2+ years out on a waiting list for one of those. There's also, I read one article that said it would take all the known lithium in the world to replace 50% of the vehicles, across the United States. And so I think there needs to be some advancements in the battery technology as well to get more than just, the lithium ion batteries. So I think 50% in just 8 years seems aggressive to me. But I think it's going to be a slow and steady increase over the next, 10 to 20 years, maybe to get to that point.
I think it will be slow. It certainly has been, although I noticed there's a ramping up of interest in EVs, and not just because gas prices are up. As people start buying them and driving them and liking them, more and more people are mentioning them to their neighbors and their friends. And as that begins to happen, you can see how the growth of interest and demand in electric vehicles is going up and up and up, mostly from people driving them. I always figured that would happen. Once you drive an electric vehicle, you're so impressed with how smooth and powerful and responsive it is that pretty soon you start thinking, boy, this is all I want to drive. It's an electric car. And as more and more people adopt them, more and more of their friends are going to start hearing it from people they know, as opposed to reading an article or seeing some program on TV. If your neighbor is talking to you over the fence and he says, man, I bought one of those electric cars and I love it. That's when people really start thinking about adopting. And so we might start seeing that ramp up a lot faster.
Yeah, this definitely is one of the more challenging parts of all of our past studies regarding electric vehicles is how do you forecast adoption rates? There's so many variables to it, and there's so many variables in terms of national studies about how quickly we'll see those adoption rates and how quickly we'll see new vehicle sales shift. That's why we have such a broad range in our forecast with kind of a lower and upper forecast. Of course, that's going to vary a lot nationally. We'll see on the coasts and are seeing a lot faster adoption than we'll see here. It's also dependent a lot on, I think, new technology. Of course, we've seen battery technology really provide a lot of benefits and range that I think are making this a lot more desirable. And as we see some of the incentives rolling out for purchase of used electric vehicles that make it more affordable for a broader range of the population, that could have a big impact as well. So I think the phrase is all forecasts and models are wrong, but some are valuable. So it's going to be really interesting seeing what happens over the next 5 to 10 years.
So we know now from talking to you guys that those estimates may be off. We don't know. But if the prediction is right that half of US vehicles are electric by 2030, how will the electric grid keep up? Adam, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so I mean, we put some quick numbers together on this fact, and if there is a 50% adoption rate in Iowa with our customers, that would increase our peak load by about 8%. So maybe it's not as dramatic as some people might think it's going to be. So if you spread that 8% over the next 8 years, it's a 1% growth each year, and that's we can easily handle that in our typical planning phases for new electric additions, generation additions, that sort of thing. I think one thing to keep in mind too, and maybe Marc can touch on this better, but I think most EV owners probably charge at home and charge at night. MidAmerican's peak load is in the afternoon, during the summers when air conditioners are running. And so a lot of the time EV owners are charging, it doesn't line up with that peak demand, that peak load. And we also offer a time of use rate to incentivize people to charge at night in those off-peak hours. So we think whatever the load growth is with EVs, we think it'll be easily managed, because it'll be gradual with our planning processes. And we think it won't be as big of impact as most people think, because most people will be charging at night when the peak demand isn't there for our utility.
Yeah, I really agree with what Adam has said. I think a lot of people are worried about the impact on the grid, and the part they miss if they don't own an electric car is that you can schedule the charging very easily and simply. And recently in California, this latest hot summer, they put in an advisement to people to try to raise their thermostats, and they asked electric car owners, could you please wait to charge until after 9 p.m. And for electric vehicle owners, that's not a burden. It's not hard. I mean, they just go out and set it on your dash and say, okay, start charging at 9 p.m. And a lot of the places offer these time of use rates where it's much cheaper to use nighttime electricity. And so just naturally, EV owners, many of them are charging at night. And when you do that, nighttime demand can be as much as 40% lower than it is at peak. And so you could add an awful lot of EVs and not exceed that 40% drop that happens in the middle of the night. So I'm not too worried about the growth of the grid. It'll be gradual, and our grid operators will be aware of it, and they'll be planning for it and hoping to manage it. I think it'll be fine.
So for those of us who don't have an EV, Marc, tell us how that works, in terms of setting up a outlet that works. And it sounds like you can program it rather than just having to physically plug it in when you want to charge.
Yeah, so the timing can happen on either the charge port that you plug into. The one I have is made by Schneider, and I can set it on a delay to delay 2 hours or delay 3 hours or 6 hours. But most of the EV cars have a dash control panel that you can pop up and say, I want to start charging at 9 o'clock, or I want to start charging at midnight. And then you just plug in and you go into your house and you have dinner and you do whatever, and then you go to sleep. And sometime during the night, when you set the timer, your EV starts charging. And some of the more advanced ones can even say, I don't care when you start charging, as long as you're done by 5 a.m. And so you can set a time to be finished kind of thing for your charge. I also think it's a nice opportunity for our grid operators to manage demand. We have a thing like that. I know Alliant has a thing called Smart Hours, where if you sign up for Smart Hours, you can register your smart thermostat for your air conditioner, and based on your agreement with the utility, they can slow down your usage during a high usage period. The same kind of Smart Hours thing could be used for electric vehicles. You could have an agreement that says, I don't really care when you turn my charger on, as long as it's ready by the time I need to go to work. And so at night, if there's extra wind energy floating around that otherwise might go to waste, if the utilities put in a smart charging program like that with contracts with their customers, they'd be able to help manage that load. And it'd be good for everybody if we manage that nighttime load.
So it's kind of like your crock pot. You can set it and it'll start, doing its work.
Yep. And you control it over the internet. So having your utility authorized to control the charging of your car wouldn't be that difficult technically.
Great. I wanted to talk a little bit about the tax credits that Stu mentioned. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in August calls for tax credits for buying EVs. And I believe, if I have that right, it's $7,500 for a new EV and up to $4,000 for a used EV. And there may be some incentives from companies as well. But I know there's some limits and things like that. How much will Iowans be able to utilize those tax credits?
Well, those tax credits for 2023 are a bit up in the air at this moment. The way the law is written, it depends on where your car is manufactured, your final assembly, the final assembly of the batteries, and the hard part's going to be, it also depends on where the minerals are sourced. So did you get your lithium from Australia, or did the lithium come from Chile? And do we have a fair trade agreement with Australia or Chile? And do you even know where your lithium came from? You're at General Motors, you're making batteries. Do they track where the lithium has been coming from? I doubt if they are doing that. So I think for 2023, some person that works for the federal government is going to be assigned the task to figure out, okay, for 2023, what are we going to do about how much money they get per car, per company, per rebate? And in the end, I think for 2023, they're going to end up kind of punting, because it's not so easy to track the source of all those materials. By 2024, they'll begin to develop protocols for tracking those resources based on the IRA Act, and it'll be easier then. But for 2023, someone's just going to have to decide, for this car, for this company, it's going to be this much. And I don't think we'll see the final rendering until December, when somebody makes I'll just call it a technical term here, a guess as to what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, so I think Erin and Marc hit on the federal incentives as well. I know there's a $7,500 for like the passenger vehicle, but there's also increased incentives for some of the commercial vehicles as well, the heavier vehicles. So those are the federal incentives. MidAmerican, I mean, we've been doing this for a few years again to try to incentivize and encourage ownership for our electric customers. We offer a $500 rebate to our customers if they purchase a new EV. And then we also offer a $1,500 rebate to our commercial customers who want to apply that towards charging stations for their employees.
Anything you would add, Stu? Just
Yeah,
before we move on.
probably not on the tax credit side. Maybe a related issue is with the funds that we'll be administering for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, there is a Buy America requirement where this equipment has to primarily be manufactured in the country. And the federal government right now is working on a bit of a waiver for that to provide some time for manufacturers to expand their capacity that exists in the country right now to produce that infrastructure, because of course we have 50 states that all now have this infusion of money. So there's going to be a lot of demand for that equipment. So the federal government has recognized they need to look at a way to slowly allow the capacity to build up in the country to provide that equipment. But that we do expect that's going to be a bit of a challenge in how quickly we can get this equipment out onto the system.
A technical question from someone in the audience. Does conversion of space heating to electric heat pumps have the potential to alter the time of day peak load on the grid enough to affect the EV charging timing decision?
Oh boy. I mean, I couldn't tell you, but I think like Marc said before, I think there's ways to more effectively manage the grid and the time of use. So if there is the flexibility in when things can be used, like Marc mentioned, thermostats, air conditioning is a big load. EVs will be a big load as well. So I mean, I think as long as there's flexibility in the time you can use that, or periods you can shut them off for a short period of time, I don't think there'll be any detrimental impact to the grid. And I think the grid will be able to be more managed to take advantage of, renewables, like Marc said, and when renewables produce.
Great. I wanted to ask, I believe, Adam, you mentioned just other sorts of vehicles like commercial vehicles, trucks, that kind of thing. It seems like when I did that story in July, just about registrations for EVs, there's some questions about those other types of vehicles and how they should be registered. Stu, I don't know if you could weigh into what sorts of decisions are kind of coming down the pipeline in terms of different sorts of electric vehicles.
Yeah, so we certainly do expect to see a wide variety of electric vehicles enter the vehicle registration system in the state. Of course, there's other federal programs that are out there to support that. Of course, one area is with our public transit vehicles. There is, as part of the infrastructure bill, they greatly expanded an existing national discretionary program that provides funding for low and no emission public transit vehicles. And the state of Iowa, we secured a grant of about, I think it was about $24 million to support the purchase of electric buses and supporting charging infrastructure at some of our transit agencies. I know the Des Moines Area Regional Transit Agency received a grant in the last couple of years from that same program to fund some large electric buses. And I know MidAmerican worked with DART on that, so I'm sure Adam can talk more about that. There also, as part of the infrastructure bill, there is a very large EPA-run program to provide some rebates to school districts for electric school buses. So we should be hearing notice here in the next few months about that. And I know there's a lot of interest in across school districts in Iowa. And then, of course, the other area is with these large commercial semi-trucks that are electric powered. And I know Tesla just announced recently that they're finally going to start production I think with first truck deliveries here in December for Pepsi, I believe it is. And I know there's some trucking companies in Iowa that have orders for some Tesla electric trucks, and Daimler Chrysler also has some that they'll be building. And of course, when we start talking about those larger vehicles, then we're start talking about much more massive amounts of electricity and the demand on the system for that. Again, I'm sure Adam can talk much more about that. So, of course, electric vehicles, passenger vehicles are more where we're seeing that real push now, but it's going to pretty quickly start expanding across other vehicle types.
And, you know, the way that the system's set up right now, you pay a registration fee for an electric vehicle. It's not a perfect system because it's not getting at how much you drive, unlike the gas tax. Do you think there's a way to improve that, to collect more from people who are driving more?
Yeah, so working with the Iowa legislature, of course, they began by directing the Iowa DOT to do a study back in 2018, looking at the impact of electric vehicles on the state road use tax fund. The state road use tax fund provides the majority of funding for the DOT and cities and counties to maintain and improve our public roadways. And 40% of that revenue comes from the fuel tax. So, you know, if overnight all vehicles became electric vehicles, we'd see a 40% reduction in our state road funding. So the legislature directed us to do a study, which we did, and we made some recommendations, and the legislature adopted them in the 2019 session. And so we took a two-step approach to addressing that issue. One approach was what a lot of other states have done, which is to charge a supplemental annual vehicle registration fee. That was phased in over 3 years, so it's now fully in place. It's a different rate if you're a battery electric vehicle versus a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So that's fully in place. The other approach, to get at what you asked, Erin, is to also establish a per kilowatt hour fee for non-residential charging. And so the supplemental registration fee was intended to more get those user fees from Iowans that own vehicles and do most of their charging, 80-90% of their charging at home. The per kilowatt hour non-residential fee is to get those non-Iowans that are just driving through the state and charging in Iowa, so they're paying their fair share, but also to get at that commercial truck usage. Commercial trucks will not be subject to that supplemental registration fee, but certainly they won't be paying diesel fuel taxes if they're charging with electricity. So that per kilowatt hour fee takes effect July 1 of this year. That had a much longer phase in just because it is a brand new user fee collection mechanism. So wanted to provide some more time to both get ready to implement that fee and also to better allow the system to be ready to collect and pay that fee.
Stu, I have a question for you about that excise tax fee. There's a number of level 2 chargers all around the state that are in places like restaurants or motels, places like that, where the charging has been free because administratively it's easier just to make it free, and it's usually not that much electricity. What will happen to those people after that excise tax kicks in? Will they have to start collecting the tax?
Yeah, so the step that will be underway here soon is Department of Revenue will be undertaking some rulemaking for how to implement that code language. I think technically by Iowa code, that fee is applicable because it's non-residential charging. But certainly I imagine there will be a recognition that there's not mechanisms in place. If they're not separately metered, some of that older charging infrastructure doesn't track kilowatt hours. So I would imagine through the rulemaking, there'll be some recognition that there's a transition period for that older charging equipment.
Changing gears again, if someone from Iowa wants to buy an EV, what's the availability like here? Marc, I know that you monitor this through EV user groups on social media. What cars are you seeing in Iowa, and how hard is it to get one?
Well, it's been pretty hard. That's a simple answer. All across the board, this chip shortage has really hurt not only regular gasoline-powered cars, but pretty much all cars. That's beginning to ease up. Tesla's haven't had as near as big a problem because they jumped in right away as a pretty powerful software company to rewrite their operating system for the car to accommodate a variety of different chips. And so they haven't been hit too hard. Most other companies have, but it's easing. I know now General Motors is beginning to produce the Bolt. Again, they took sort of a vacation, or they weren't producing it for a while, but now they are. And the sales have been pretty high. In fact, they just saw an article in the last week or so that their Chevy Bolt is now, they're going to double the production rate for this next upcoming year. So you're starting to see them appear more and more all the time. But it's still, in Iowa, we're not what I would consider a hot EV market just yet. So if you go to a dealer here, like a Kia dealer, you're not going to find very many electric vehicles on the lot. If you go to a Chevy dealer, you're going to begin now to find them on the lot. But not too many other brands are showing up in big numbers just yet. Outside the Iowa market, the appearance of EVs is beginning to ramp up.
I know someone had mentioned the Ford Lightning pickup. There's also another pickup. Is it Rivian? I'm trying to remember what the brand is on that one.
Yep, that's right, Rivian. They're also making a lot of delivery vehicles for Amazon. You know, we've seen some plans from Amazon in our service territory at their distribution centers over the next few years. Again, it's been the slow supply of the EVs, but you know, we've seen plans for Amazon and others across our service territory and across the nation where they've announced plans to replace a lot of their delivery trucks for in-town deliveries with Rivians. So I know they produce both the little pickup truck and then the delivery vehicles for Amazon as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of excitement on the Facebook group when someone sees one of these vehicles out in the wild.
I've seen a couple of the Rivians around Des Moines. You know, I think the availability is low, but I think a lot of manufacturers are pumping a lot of money into it now and have been for the last year or so. So, you know, just one example at our facility here in Urbandale, Iowa, we offer some charging to employees here. And I think I've seen maybe 5 different types of EVs using those chargers and that are just meant for employees here in our parking lot. So we're starting to see the availability from multiple manufacturers. You know, it's not just Tesla, it's not just Chevy anymore. There's a lot of car companies pumping money into the programs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kind of asking about that, you know, is that something we're seeing as a new idea out there? Maybe a benefit to employees is having charging at work?
I think it's personally, I think it's a very good, fairly inexpensive incentive, you know, for your employees. And even thinking about me personally, you know, if you could commute to work and your employer was offering charging stations at work, you could charge during the day. You may never have to pay for fuel again, you know, if they're offering you that incentive. So I think it's a fairly inexpensive benefit that companies can provide, one that MidAmerican provides. And I know there's a number of other companies across Iowa that provide that to their employees as well.
Workplace charging is a really nice opportunity for companies to offer that benefit. And one of the reasons is if you're parked someplace for 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day, depending what your workday is like, you can pick up quite a bit of charge just off of a simple 120 volt outlet. And most EVs come with a 120 volt charge cord that you can plug into any outlet. And so you can pick up easily 40 miles of range just by sitting there all day long in the parking lot. Doesn't cost the company much because the amount of electricity it takes for 40 miles is pretty minimal. The cost of installing a 120 volt outlet is pretty small. And so it's a really good advantage for companies. It also has a nice advantage for the society. In California, they have so much solar being installed that they actually have, in some cases, kind of an excess of solar power during the day when the sun is shining. If more people had workplace charging, they could soak up some of that excess solar without having to use batteries to store it for later. People could be plugged in at work. They could be charging up kind of slow on these 120 volt outlets, and yet it would be soaking up a lot of that extra solar electricity availability.
Marc, your response makes me think of an article I had read a couple years ago now after the derecho show about people using their electric vehicle as backup energy for their homes. I don't know if the panel wants to address this.
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that. I think right now there's limited availability for EVs with bidirectional charging. But I think that is, again, changing as technology advances and more manufacturers are realizing the potential benefit and planning for the bidirectional charging in those EV vehicles.
Yeah, for example, the new Kias for 2023, now all their models include what they call vehicle to load. And you can buy a little device that's about the size of a big cucumber, and it plugs into the charge port and has a regular 120 volt outlet on the back. And so you can run anything that runs up to 1500 watts off of that. So if you had a grid outage and you had a Kia like that, you could plug in one of these devices and run your fridge or your freezer, or possibly power your furnace if you had a big ice storm. So it's a nice feature, and it's beginning to appear on a number of different EVs. On cars that were produced prior to this time, there's some private experimenting going on where people will buy a little inverter and plug it into their 12 volt accessory battery, which can be kept charged by your EV. And I just read an article about a guy in Florida after Hurricane Ian. He had a Chevy Bolt, and he kept his freezer alive for 5 days while the grid was down, just by plugging in a simple inverter and then running his freezer off that inverter.
Well, just in a world where we're seeing more extreme weather, it seems like that's an idea out there that could prove to be helpful in terms, as opposed to maybe having to have a battery or a generator.
Yeah, if you think about it in terms of a house battery, an EV is like a really big house battery on wheels. So if you can tap into that, that's a good thing.
Question from the audience here. I think this would probably be for you, Stu. I know the federal government was really planning to ramp up its the EVs and its fleet. Do you know the status to which EVs make up the fleet for Iowa's state-owned vehicles?
I don't have an exact number. I can say that at least here at the Iowa DOT, we do have 2 Chevy Bolts in our fleet for just going to meetings across the state. We haven't pursued that yet with our heavy duty fleet and snow plows. We've certainly done a lot of experimenting and research and using more renewable fuels for our heavy duty fleet, and I'm sure as equipment becomes available, we'll look into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think those electric buses, some of the cities are trying, could be good proving grounds to some degree. Another question from the audience: what provisions are in place to assist EV owners who do not have a garage or access to easy overnight charging? I suppose workplaces could help there.
Yeah, workplaces could help there. I mean, I don't know if we're talking about, apartment owners, condo owners, or stuff like that, but maybe a consideration for developers as well is to, if you're an apartment complex owner, condo complex owner, is to install charging bays for the complex, if there's not personal access available.
I think that'll be driven by demand, and as people start adopting EVs more, there'll be people that approach their apartment house, say, well, I'm thinking about moving here. Do you have chargers where I can charge my electric car? And if they go, oh, no, we don't. It goes, okay, well, I'll just keep looking then. And eventually that'll trigger apartment owners to begin to offer that kind of charging infrastructure.
Yeah, I imagine that's a problem in bigger cities, maybe not as much in rural parts of the country, but an interesting question. Well, we are getting close to winding down, but I wanted to ask our panelists just one kind of fun question at the end. We all, or most of us, I think, have like our dream car that we love to see out on the road. if you could have one car, make or model, electrified, what would it be?
I'll start. I'm a truck driver. I mean, I do own a fairly fuel efficient turbo diesel truck. Gets very good gas mileage, but that's a thing for me. I think when I think about my personal situation, I have 3 kids. I have big vehicles. There's not a lot of big EVs out there that can support hauling around, big families and all the stuff that comes with big families in the back. So I think as hopefully as more models are available, like the Lightning, that's in high demand, but getting more of the full size vehicles in EV form would be very helpful for at least people like me with big families and a lot of stuff that go with big families.
So like a Suburban or
Yep, Suburbans, okay. Trucks, the stuff. And when I'm going to baseball games on the weekend, my back end is full of stuff and kids, and you need big vehicles to handle that. So, that's something that would interest me in the EV market if available.
Great. Stu or Marc?
I think for myself, it's just my wife and I, we're both retired. We do occasionally haul 1 or 2 grandchildren around with us, so we don't have a big family need. So we're more interested in a compact vehicle that's easy to park and doesn't cost a lot of money. I think from a appeal point of view, I'd rather have a Tesla Model 3, which is a kind of a smaller version of the Tesla. But my pocketbook's going to guide me toward a Chevy Bolt, I think, in the near future. So they're quite a bit less expensive than a Tesla.
Stu, what about you?
Well, you said dream car, Erin. So
yeah.
I'll have to go with the high-end Tesla that gives me lots of range. I do a lot of traveling across the state, so that's what I'll go for.
Okay. Well, I'll just add in. I'm a Ford Ranger fan, so I want that. But that's why I've heard the Rivian is kind of like a small pickup. But we can all dream, right?
Erin, are you going to announce that all the panelists are being awarded electric vehicles as a result of being on the panel today?
I am not Oprah, so just
Okay.
put that out of your head. But I will offer you my most sincere thanks for joining our panel here today. It's been a great conversation, and I want to thank you all, our great panelists. We've got Stu Anderson from the Iowa DOT, Adam Jablonski from MidAmerican Energy, and Marc Franke, an EV owner and former engineer from Ely. And thanks to our online audience and your great questions today. We have 2 more energy and environment sessions left this afternoon. The next at 3:15 is on siting decisions for animal feeding operations, solar and wind farms. And then our last session is the big idea session from 4:20 to 5 p.m. about Mississippi River water quality. So thanks again to our panelists and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.